Welcome to Conversations. I'm Muqtedar, your host, and today I'm going to talk to you about a very important defense summit that took place in Singapore at the Shangri-La Hotel. So this conference is organized by IISS, the London-based International Institute for Security Studies, and many defense secretaries, defense ministers from about 36 countries also spoke there. There were defense contractors and companies from over 40 countries, all of this in Singapore. Today, in this diplomatic briefing, I'm going to essentially talk about the clash that took place between Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, and the Chinese Defense Minister, General Li Shangfu. Of course, these days, increasingly, when you're in Europe, all you talk about is Russia and Ukraine. And when you're in Asia these days, all you talk about is China and Taiwan, or the US-China relationship, which is increasingly becoming more and more hostile and confrontational. But before I begin this diplomatic briefing, for those of you who are coming to Conversations for the first time, please subscribe to Conversations, like this video, ring the bell icon so you get notifications every time I post a fresh video. And of course, remember to share this with your friends and your colleagues and your social network. So one of the things that to me is striking about this important conference, there were lots of defense related issues are discussed, specifically the Indo-Pacific strategy with the United States. It's so aggressively pushing in the region, increasingly calling the region itself as Indo-Pacific, whereas the Chinese call it Asia-Pacific region. The thing that struck me out was the absence of India's defense minister. There were defense ministers from all the Quad countries except India. There were defense ministers from all the other prominent nations in the Indo-Pacific/Asia-Pacific region. But for some mysterious reason, the Indian defense minister was missing. I know people in India think this must be another masterstroke that most people cannot understand. So I don't know why he chose not to attend. Perhaps because the Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin was scheduled to come to India, and he is in India at the moment, so maybe they needed to prepare better for him. I don't know what the reasons are. I couldn't find any official explanation as to why he was missing, but I think such opportunities do a disservice to India's national security and foreign policy when you are not there to voice your view, your point of view, your national interests, your concerns about the region with other countries who have come there specifically to discuss these issues. But anyway, in his plenary session, Lloyd Austin made some very interesting points. To me, the most important one, or shall we say the thing that jumped out was that he projected this whole Indo-Pacific strategy, whatever we want to call it, the emergence of this bloc called Indo-Pacific. There is an economic side to it in which there are 14 countries. And then there is the Quad, which is supposed to be a kind of a military alliance, but India does not like to think of it as a military alliance. Nevertheless, he projected it as if it was an idea that emerged from the region and was not something that was being pushed by Washington, D.C., even to a great lengths to make the case.
More and more, the countries of the Indo-Pacific have come together around a compelling vision of the future, and they're advancing it in unprecedented ways. It's a vision of a region in which all countries are free to thrive on their own terms without coercion or intimidation or bullying. It is a vision of a free and open and secure Indo-Pacific within a world of rules and rights. And that vision is anchored in some key principles: respect for sovereignty, adherence to international law, transparency and openness, the free flow of commerce and ideas, human rights and human dignity, equal rights for all states, large and small, and resolving disputes through peaceful dialogue and not coercion or conquest.
And as you can see from the video that I included, that he tries to say that these are the interests of the countries of the region. They want an open and free Indo-Pacific region, which is secure, a region that follows rules and respects rights, a region that respects sovereignty, international law, free flow of ideas, respects human rights, and equal rights of nations. And he says when there are disagreements, he hopes that they will be resolved through dialogue and not necessarily through conflict. So all of this, he says, are the interests of the countries of the region. And so they have come up with this idea of the Indo-Pacific. So to me, that was this Indo-Pacific bloc or Indo-Pacific initiative, whatever. At some point, I'm sure the international community will settle on a particular nomenclature for this. He also named a few of his countries and appreciated them, especially his Quad partners. He welcomed Japan's new national security strategy, which essentially doubles Japan's defense budget and makes Japan a much more powerful country. And the Japanese prime minister has made it very clear that this extra money, extra expenditure on defense will essentially enhance Japan's airstrike capability or counter-strike capability. Basically, it means that until now, Japan's defense budget was essentially geared towards developing weapons and strategies and defense doctrines which are defensive. Japan would fight only if attacked. But now, even though the term counter-offensive and counter-strike capabilities are basically, Japan is now going to spend money on developing offensive capabilities. So I guess getting ready for a preemptive strike somewhere. And the US Secretary of Defense welcomed this change in Japan's national security strategy and was quite appreciative of the initiative and the resources that Japan is spending of it, probably a large subset of that dollars will be coming to the United States military industrial complex. He also welcomed the growing cooperation between Japan and South Korea and is also quite pleased. And he went out of his way to point out that South Korea's Indo-Pacific approach essentially believes in this and that. So that was also interesting. He wanted to signal that South Korea is on board. I keep wondering why South Korea is not part of the Quad. It's such an important country, one of the top 10 economies, top 10 spenders on defense, close ally of the United States. I guess that's probably going to happen soon. He also talked about enhanced American presence in the region, enhanced US troop presence, so there will be more troops of the US place, more Navy, I guess, and more and bigger exercises with countries in the region. And to me, that was clearly saying that the United States is going to increase its military footprint in the Indo-Pacific region. Why? It looks like it's already fortifying in preparation for what is feared that China may make a dash to capture and annex Taiwan after seeing how well Russia's invasion of Ukraine is going. An event happened just a few days ago where US and Canadian navies sailed through the Taiwan Strait, and Chinese fighter jets, as usual, buzzed American aircraft, and the Secretary of Defense brought it up. This is happening frequently. Every time American forces, especially planes, are flying in the region, Chinese jet fighters also confront them and intercept them in rather aggressive fashion. And for more than a couple of years, the Pentagon has been expressing fear that there might be an accident, literally like a collision between American and Chinese fighter jets, and that could trigger an unnecessary battle which could spin out of control.
By Global News, the Chinese warship reportedly coming within 150 yards of hitting the American destroyer, the USS Chung Hoon. It happened during a rare joint mission between Canada and the U.S. Earlier this week, the Pentagon released new video of a Chinese fighter jet coming within 400 feet of a U.S. reconnaissance plane over the South China Sea.
But China essentially is arguing that while they understand the need to keep the lanes free and open, why is the U.S. sending its military and navy in that area? The Secretary of Defense also spoke about India and appreciated India's role in the G20, as he appreciated Japan's role as leader of G7 for this year in 2023. And he especially went out of the way to point out the enhanced participation in military exercises by India. And he also mentioned about the significance of US and India's cooperation in what is called as the initiative for essentially emerging technologies, critical emerging technologies, called ICET, Initiative on Critical Emerging Technologies, which could be satellite surveillance, drones. He also talked about how the US is working with Japan to develop uncrewed, I guess, instead of saying unmanned, uncrewed aircrafts, basically drones which are going to substitute fighter planes. And so it basically talked about US increased technology, US increased presence, and US increased support. He talked about $10 billion that are going to be spent more in US defense posture and defense assets in the region. So he concluded by essentially calling for a dialogue with China. And he said it's critically important. First, he castigated China for trying to bully its neighbors and said that coercive and bullying behavior is unacceptable. If there are disagreements, they should be settled through a dialogue. And then he said it's important for the United States and China to establish a dialogue, especially dialogue between military leaders. I guess it is probably one of the best ways to make sure that there are no misunderstandings of the other party's intentions.
The United States believes that open lines of communication with the People's Republic of China are essential, especially between our defense and military leaders. For responsible defense leaders, the right time to talk is any time. The right time to talk is every time. And the right time to talk is now. Dialogue is not a reward. It is a necessity. And a cordial handshake over dinner is no substitute for a substantive engagement.
I was surprised that there was no discussion of the Chinese balloons that kind of were flying all over the United States a few months ago, and the United States actually shot one of them down. There was a question that was asked by, I think, a Chinese reporter or a Chinese, I guess, person who was present at the conference, and he asked that, was there a contradiction in the US claim that ASEAN is central to the region, and then also creating AUKUS and Quad? Quad is the four-country partnership with US, India, Japan, and Australia, which focuses on keeping Indo-Pacific free. AUKUS is the three-country English-speaking countries, Australia, UK, and the US, which is developing submarine technology and also doing the same thing. I guess at one end of the Indo-Pacific, you have the Quad with India, and at the other end, you have the Quad with Australia. You have the trio with Australia, the AUKUS. So the Chinese questioner essentially wanted to know if this was a contradiction. If ASEAN was central, why was the US not working through ASEAN? Why the need to create this alternative institutions, and the Secretary of Defense answer was not a very strong answer. Anyway, the Chinese general and defense minister Li Shangfu started basically by talking about China's criticism of U.S. role in the region and the criticism of this whole talk of Cold War-like relations between the U.S. and China.
Today, as we look around, we see sluggish global economic recovery, resurging Cold War mentality, rising regional conflicts, and security threats emerging one after another. Our world is far from tranquil, and people across the countries long for peace, development, and cooperation. President Xi Jinping has proposed the Global Security Initiative, or GSI, and he calls for promoting common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security, and exploring a new path to security featuring dialogue over confrontation, partnership over alliance, and win-win over the zero-sum. The GSI contributes China's wisdom to addressing global security challenges.
And essentially, he decried that one of the threats and dangers to international security is the Cold War mentality. This whole idea of identifying an enemy, building alliances against that enemy, trying to contain and isolate, and Chinese see that as an attempt by the United States and its allies to prevent China's economic development. China still likes to pretend that it's a developing country, even though it has the second highest gross GDP in the region, in the world, second only to the US. So it feels that the United States is conspiring in a Cold War-like fashion to essentially impede China's economic development and its geopolitical strategies, which are essential for its economic development. But he also sent a very strong signal that there should be no attempt to essentially for Taiwan to declare its independence, and basically promised that China would fight very aggressively till the end if Taiwan were to attempt to declare an independence. The U.S. Secretary of Defense, in his plenary remarks, did emphasize that the U.S. continues to support its one China policy and does not support Taiwan's independence, but also essentially said that they will not stand for any bullying in the region. And so all the aggressive moves that China makes towards Taiwan will be responded to by the US and its allies. The Chinese defense minister also talked about how the US was building NATO-like alliances in the Asia-Pacific, basically referring to Quad and AUKUS, and basically indicated that these were not good for the region. And then he explained to a great extent how China's wisdom and China's intelligence and China's vision for a country, for a world which focuses on development and peaceful relations was essentially recently articulated by Xi Jinping in their new global security strategy. At some point, I will take a closer look at that global security strategy policy paper and talk about it. So stay tuned for that. I also want to make this point that it was a very interesting conference, and I did go through and watched both the statements, and they were clearly sparring. The United States requested a one-on-one meeting between the US Secretary of Defense and the Defense Minister of China, and the Chinese declined to meet, even though they did shake hands at the dinner where they all had dinner together, I guess. And apparently some Chinese lower-ranked defense officials privately told people that China will not initiate and not participate in any dialogue or communication with the defense leaders in the United States, Secretary of Defense and below, until two things have happened. And One of that thing is essentially an attempt to, there are sanctions imposed on Lee, and until those sanctions were essentially removed, they will not have a dialogue with their counterparts. So that means that China is willing to have a dialogue, but would want the United States to also reduce its confrontational rhetoric with regards to China, constantly identifying China as a threat to the region and to all the countries in the world. So basically, the Chinese want the United States to reduce its confrontational dialogue and also lift sanctions off Li Shangfu himself. And those sanctions were imposed by the US because China had bought some high-end, I guess, rocket technology or missile technology from Russia, which violates United States law and says anybody who buys advanced technology from Russia, helping Russia and Russian defense industry will be sanctioned. So Li Shangfu has been sanctioned under that law, and they want those sanctions lifted before there is any dialogue between the US. I think these events are interesting for those of us who obviously are interested in looking at great power rivalry and also regional and international security. Events like this help us understand what developments are taking place and what new ideas are shaping governments' national security policies and defense policies. And we also can see the shifting alliances that are taking place at the global and at the regional level. I was hoping to talk about India, China, as well as the United States, but since India's Minister of Defense was missing in action, I will not be able to talk about, but we know that increasingly India does see China as a threat in the Indo-Pacific region and also on its own borders. It is beginning to recognize the significance of the United States support. And I think when India's Prime Minister visits Washington, D.C. for a state visit in 2 weeks' time, these issues will be discussed. And I guess we will get to hear the latest way of thinking in India on these matters. I hope you found this diplomatic briefing useful, thought-provoking, makes you think about these issues, clarifies some issues to you. And if so, definitely subscribe to Conversations if you've not already done so. Ask your friends and your social network to do so. Don't forget to ring the bell icon. It will let you know when I post my next briefing. And don't forget to like the video. This is Muqtedar Khan, and until next time, be safe, keep reading about international affairs and world politics, and keep watching Conversations. Bye.